And here leadership comes into play again, setting this framework, establishing these guidelines, but also giving employees and teams enough room to maneuver.
Sometimes I come in and think, wow, what's going on here? Is everyone in a bad mood somehow?
And to ensure that they can still move somewhat autonomously within this system, because otherwise we have employees who don't think, and then, to speak a bit provocatively, we might as well replace them with AI.
Dear listeners, welcome to a new episode of our podcast, Digital.Decoded. Together with André, I host this. A warm welcome to you too, André. I'm glad that we are together again today. Today, we are discussing a special topic about people and organizations. And we want to talk about it and see what areas of tension we might be able to create there, dear André. Perhaps a quote to start. Organizations want performance, people want meaning. Why does this often collide, and what can we learn from it? Or perhaps what must we learn from it?
Yes, that's quite a provocative quote, Mario. So organizations want performance, people need or want meaning. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, because if we look at how organizations are structured today and the principles by which they operate, those are processes, systems, and KPIs. And what do we humans need, Mario? Do you have an idea?
Yes, a sense of meaning.
A sense of meaning? Yes. One could say we need a system that gives us something back to some extent. And in some organizations that only think in terms of processes, KPIs, and systems, this can be quite challenging for some people.
Yes, but now we also have the case, especially now with the EU AI Act, which we have already discussed, dear André. It's also the case that there are an incredible number of regulations, and companies naturally face the challenge of documenting everything because the state wants it. Are we overregulated by now?
I don't know if we are overregulated. I believe we must not overlook the necessity for organizations to have a system, meaning they naturally fall under certain regulations, and that's how our economy has developed. Nevertheless, from my perspective, leadership comes into play here. And leadership doesn't necessarily mean just being nice. So leadership should not be confused with niceness. Rather, it also means providing support, structure, and setting a direction. And when we think about regulations, Mario, you and I probably think of many regulations that might not necessarily be sensible, or, let's say, hold us back a bit from our daily tasks and seem bothersome, yet are still necessary. And I am firmly convinced that leadership has the task of clarifying the necessity and also setting the direction.
Yes, direction is crucial. Direction also gives meaning. That must be clearly stated. We already talked about this in one topic. Organizations frustrate people and vice versa. I still find that a really great thesis. But the question, from my perspective, is if we are searching for meaning as people, how can I also provide guidance? For example, in our company, we have so-called guardrails. I find that concept really great. We didn't invent it at all. It was brought to us by an external consultant. Because one thing is the rules, and rules always mean I write down exactly how it must be. But in reality, life isn't like that. And guardrails mean this is how it could be done. And within these guardrails, I have to operate. Not beyond that, but within the guardrails, I also have freedoms.
And that's a nice example, Mario, because when we look at organizations, they strive for success, profit, market share, innovation, and so on. And we humans, and there's a very nice model that explains this called the SCARF model. And the A in the SCARF model stands for autonomy. And please do not confuse autonomy in this with autarky. Definitely. So autonomy means for me, and this is very, very important, that I naturally have to provide my employees, my teams, with a framework, but they are still part of the system. And here leadership comes into play again to set this framework, to establish these guardrails, to formulate these guidelines, but also to give employees, the teams, enough room for maneuver and to ensure that they can still move somewhat autonomously within this system, because otherwise we have employees who do not think, and then we could, to speak a bit provocatively, just replace them with AI.
Yes, fortunately, we are not there yet, but structures are also necessary. Otherwise, chaos will eventually reign. I also experience this repeatedly in daily operations, that people naturally need decisions, guardrails, and advice. I think that is always part of leadership, to also provide consultation and accordingly give advice and share experiences. In the podcast, in the trailer, we also said that we bring 50 years of experience together into these topics we discuss, and that's a huge resource. And I think it's important to pass that on. And it doesn't always have to be negative. It can also be something positive because experience makes things more efficient.
Absolutely. So experience, you just mentioned an important word, decisions, Mario. It's often said that the task of a leader is to make decisions, which is fundamentally correct. But a leader who only makes decisions and doesn't pay attention to involving the teams, the environment, the customers, the partners, won't benefit from even a good decision, because the people will not follow the leader in the company. This means that decisions in organizations are not made by one person, but by a system, and a good leader implements or considers the system, takes into account the team members, and also considers customers and partners to make appropriate decisions. And here you can see again very clearly that a leader is also part of a system and cannot make decisions independently.
But by system, you don't mean an IT system, but really the organization as a system. The organization as a system, exactly. Exactly, because at the end of the day, everyone always swears by EAT systems, and that technology ultimately does things. Predictive is increasingly coming into play, also making suggestions to facilitate decisions. But let's be honest, at the end of the day, it's the human who has to make the decision.
Exactly, the human makes the decision. And let's go back briefly, Mario. This is important to me once again. Organizations frustrate people, people frustrate organizations, and also your bold thesis at the beginning. And I believe breaking through the system. So on one hand, we have recognized that organizations have different objectives than we humans. And this is biologically, completely naturally ingrained, that we humans strive for security, that we want autonomy, that we want to have a connection to a system, to a group, and want to be treated fairly. And what plays a major role, in my view, is the topic of trust. So if you have an organizational structure that is not based on trust, then no one will voice their opinion. And if no one voices their opinion, then it becomes difficult to make the right decisions, because this conflict, which should and must take place, in my view, to make informed decisions, is simply stifled at the outset because no one dares to say anything.
It's also difficult, especially in strongly hierarchical organizations or in large international organizations. We've already had the topic of cultural clash, as I always call it. One person understands one thing, another person understands something else. It's not that easy to discuss these things in the end without people from other cultures sometimes feeling even offended.
And I believe in the papers, it's always communication. So communication. And now we're not just talking about managers, but we're talking about project leaders. We're talking about engineers. We're more talking about people in the finance sector, in the marketing sector. Communication in today's organizational system is extremely important from my perspective, especially because we have digitized so many processes, especially because we gain so many insights through, for example, artificial intelligence. It's important that we don't lose our humanity. And that includes communicating, exchanging, and communicating also means having the ability to argue. And my observation, I don't know how it is for you with Mario, my observation is that in many organizations I encounter, and they have forgotten how to argue. They have truly forgotten how to argue because everything is taken personally right away.
Yes, that's true. We have already discussed this before. I think that's a very important point. I agree with you, but I would like to bring in another point. We have also, as an organization, partially lost and forgotten how to find solutions. So even when it comes to an argument, everyone nowadays insists on their position. People don't want to budge. That's my feeling. And everyone immediately feels offended. Everyone feels personally attacked, as you once said. And I think these are already tendencies. It's becoming more radical, not just with Trump, but generally even in companies. I don't know how you feel about it. In some meetings, I always feel like there's already a basic level of aggression. Sometimes I walk in and think, wow, what's going on? Are we all in a bad mood somehow?
And that's super interesting, Mario, that you say that. I recently had a workshop with an executive team, and they also believed they could handle conflicts. They could engage in conflicts, which was fundamentally correct. But their tendency when they entered conflicts was either exactly the aggressive approach. That means someone tries to enforce their position at any cost, or the other extreme, someone withdraws and gives in because of hierarchical organization for whatever reasons. And if these two options don't work, there's always the so-called lazy compromise, Mario. Then somehow a compromise is reached, which at the end of the day means stagnation. because no one has really enforced their position. And conflicts in companies do not mean that the stronger wins and the weaker gives in, but rather the ability to engage in this conflict across hierarchies and functions to find the best solution, which is called cooperation, the best solution for the company. And that is truly conflict competence. And I miss that in many organizations.
Yes, and at the end of the day, it also has to be a win-win-win. It has to be a gain for the employee, for the company, and for the customer. Of course, it doesn't always succeed, but from my perspective, it's something that should always be sought. I'm back to the topic of finding solutions, because if only one wins, it won't work out in the end. Exactly. But I would like to discuss one thing with you. Now, it's like this. Many companies, and certainly some listeners as well. By the way, you're always welcome to give feedback both to André and to me, or to both of us. Also, give us topics that concern you, and we will gladly include them. Yes. But there's one point I would like to address again. At the end of the day, it's a transformation. If I realize that I might not be at that point today, well, then I ultimately have to initiate the transformation. And rarely is it the case that one is lost in translation, yes, or lost in transformation, as I like to say. And you always notice that as a company, and even I, as a manager, I sometimes struggle with it. You are biased yourself. You bring an experience with you. And of course, you have to change the organization in some way. Are there any success factors from your experience?
Yes, there certainly are, Mario. And I think it's important, on one hand, to first acknowledge that every change, every transformation in a company is individual. So there is no blueprint that can be transferred from one company to another, but there are a few, how should I say, ingredients that are indeed helpful. The first ingredient I always tell my clients is, if you understand transformation as a project, meaning it has a beginning and an end, then it's not a transformation, one so better not start. But in today's world, transformation is a continuous process that also changes due to external and internal conditions. And the most important thing is transformation is a mindset for me. That means if the management, the leaders, and the employees do not understand that transformation is essential for the continued success of the organization or the company, then this transformation will fail. And I mean, we both have already experienced this, Mario. In the course of a transformation, you will likely encounter a situation where you cannot bring all employees like handballs along. And that too must be accepted. And appropriate measures must be taken there as well.
And I have another point also from personal experience. You just said that at the end of the day, such a thing cannot be planned. At least that's how I understood you. You practically have to go through the individual transformation steps. I'm on board with that. But as I said, I'm also a manager. I want to eventually arrive somewhere. And we are, for example, investor-led. Yes. That means we also have investors who naturally ask me, well, when will you be done? What does the whole thing cost? What does the business case look like? And I believe that sometimes these things conflict with each other. And there we are again in practice. I have to somehow break it down and also mark it with milestones, like a project plan. Yes. And what I've honestly always noticed positively is we're back to the meaning and the people, even for myself, celebrating these small successes and saying, come on, now we've achieved this and that, and now we're one step further again. I consider that very, very important so that people don't lose interest in the transformation.
Totally. And from my perspective, you've mentioned two important points. First of all, when you say, well, we're heading somewhere, we don't know exactly where we're going yet, and we also don't know exactly when we'll be finished, then that is, in my view, incorrect communication. And also towards investors, you might do that once, but not a second time. Instead, there must be, let's say, a long-term strategy, a long-term orientation. But of course, there must be quality gates or milestones along the way to be able to adjust a little bit, to reflect. Have I achieved what I wanted to achieve? Have requirements changed, etc.? Absolutely necessary. The second thing you mentioned, Mario, I find to be an essential factor, namely communication, to also bring people along. And that involves different dimensions of people or target groups that you need to bring along, stakeholders that you need to involve. These are investors, these are your employees, these are your peers, whom you should, of course, understand in terms of their interests and also communicate accordingly to bring them along.
Now we come back to the crux of the matter, to the topic of leadership. Yes, from my perspective, leadership is something that, as you mentioned earlier, is important in the form of building a relationship, not just holding a position, but you really have to establish a connection with the employees through communication. Yes. You mentioned trust earlier, which is a very important point. And I can only speak from my own experience. I talk to each employee for at least half an hour every week. And why? Sometimes it's just, I'll call it small talk. So sometimes just now, for example, at Easter, when someone was on vacation, you might ask, hey, how was your vacation? Did you have a good rest, or did you have a nice time or something else? And I believe that this relational level is very, very important to move towards transformation.
Absolutely, you're right. I briefly mentioned the SCARF model earlier. So SCARF stands for security, certainty meaning safety. It means autonomy. It means relatedness, and it means fairness. And this relatedness is exactly what you mean by establishing this relationship, yes. And this is extremely important for us humans, in the sense that we humans frustrate organizations, and it's a major task for leaders to establish this relational level. And recently I had a conversation with the head of HR who said, man, in my company, I really miss this personal bonding where people also talk about things outside of the everyday work life. And I believe that it is extremely important to sharpen this sense of belonging to some extent, to strengthen the bonding between employees and leaders.
But one point is often overlooked in leadership. A leader doesn't always have to be just likable. A leader also has to make decisions. Yes, because at the end of the day, things do taper off towards the top. And I also work a lot with companies or medium-sized businesses that are owner-managed. I always find that very, very exciting, because when you look at corporations, decisions take forever. They are weighed 3 times. Decision papers are made. They are given to committees. Then 7 more questions are asked, and so on. And I always admire that in the medium-sized companies. We are also one ourselves. Yes. I don't know if it works like that for us. Others should judge that. But in many medium-sized companies that I know, which are also our clients, it is often the case that there is a clear decision-making structure, and this is perceived very, very positively.
Absolutely. And I would say that is, from my perspective, the big difference, or can be the big difference between medium-sized companies and, let's say, large corporate structures.
Yes.
And it has both positive and negative aspects from my perspective, Mario. So I would say if you go into a very hierarchically managed medium-sized company where the founder and CEO still makes decisions themselves and also enforces this very hierarchically, then you will most likely eventually experience a situation where they no longer properly perceive the different opinions and signals from the organization as the organizational structure grows larger.
Or doesn't receive them at all anymore.
By the way, that's a nice reference. I was just about to say, to the entire iceberg of ignorance. There's a study by Gallup, among others, where it is said 4% of the company's challenges are known to the board. Of course, everyone would say, for heaven's sake, no, I know all the problems in my company. But I believe there's a lot of truth in that. Whether it's 4, 10, or 20%, it doesn't matter. But a board member or a CEO cannot know all the challenges within the organization system. And by centralizing these decision-making processes, one might also make difficult decisions. While in large organizations, I don't always want to say that it's different in large organizations. There, it's exactly the same. Even there, only 4% of the challenges are known to the board. But through these lengthy decision-making processes, many opinions are gathered. But what I often observe, at the end of the day, the decision that was already determined at the beginning is still made, right?
Yes, exactly. And above all, the interesting thing is I have been doing CRM selections for a very, very long time, 15 years. And the funny thing is, on one hand, the decisions are already set in stone from the start. But on the other hand, even if they aren't predetermined, sometimes a decision emerges that isn't rational, but rather where at the end of the day, the gut feeling decides, right? or the facts are twisted until the right decision comes out again, right? That's quite exciting. Now, the counterpoint, dear André, to decision making is also the topic of self-organization and empowerment, as it's called in modern German. And the employees also want that. It's good from my perspective. You have to also, in order to scale, provide empowerment. But on the other hand, one must also say we're back to the topic of leadership. Empowerment also needs boundaries.
Yes, definitely boundaries. So leadership needs boundaries, and we must not confuse leadership, please, Mario, with the idea that a leader always has to be nice, right? It's about clear directives, and clear directives can sometimes be uncomfortable. That's one thing. The other thing is making autonomous decisions. I like to use in my conversations, my workshops, the image of different teams. There's a swim team, there's a soccer team, and there's a jazz band. So, and the difference, if you project this onto an organizational level, is a swim team usually, hopefully, has nothing to do with each other, but they swim in separate lanes and try to deliver their best performance individually, ideally having the same coach and training together. So they are relatively autonomous, but there are still guidelines. So then there is the soccer team, and you know yourself, there's a captain, there's a coach standing outside, and this soccer team only functions and can only win if every single pass, if every single play fits, and if the different disciplines on the field really work together seamlessly. So, and then there's the jazz band, and the jazz band is indeed a system. I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to listen to such a jazz band. I had that once, and it's really fascinating how much they can improvise, how they intuitively adjust to each other. And then the music gets into such a flow. So, and these different forms of organization at a very high level should exist in organizations and should indeed be present. And I believe the important thing is that organizations recognize whether it's an area where I have a swim team who swim parallel in lanes and can swim fast or slow, but they swim parallel. Or do I have a jazz band that needs to work very, very closely together? And depending on what kind of team you have, you can, of course, set these guidelines, these regulations, and this clarity a bit more broadly, or you need to define them more narrowly.
I don't know if you've ever dealt with the topic of holacracy. We used to have a modified form of it. So before the merger, and it really worked great. And why did it work well? So our ultimate goal was basically just to have the corporate body. We were a corporation, so we had to have a board at the end of the day. But everything below that should and was increasingly organized into circles. So that means in the past, people always said working group in German. So it's naturally a bit different. What I found really exciting about this form was that you still had structures, even though self-organization was emphasized. So the meetings always had a very specific structure, which I found great, by the way. Yes, there was always a check-in and check-out. And some people said, yeah, man, this is a waste of time. Everyone's saying how they feel or if it's good. But you noticed that a certain dynamic took place. Everyone was always allowed to say something. Yes, of course, you also get the very quiet ones to the microphone, so to speak. And I found that quite admirable. And on the other hand, the different speeds you mentioned, yes, you noticed that too. In some circles, things were really lively. And in others, it just somehow didn't work because the composition of the circle was partly wrong or because this self-determination wasn't practiced.
Right. And that always depends on the characters, or how you compose this circle. And diversity plays a big role, not just gender diversity, but different perspectives, opinions, backgrounds, and so on, to bring these circles to life. And I also believe, Mario, I know the principle, it's not suitable for every organizational form. For some, it is suitable, yes, but not for all, because it requires a lot of self-discipline. And sorry to say, many employees simply don't have much self-discipline. And that's not a bad thing at all, because they want to live in a system where they need or want structure.
Yes, that's a very interesting point, because we introduced it and really lived it for 2 or 3 years. It also kept getting better. But what was really exciting was, as I said, we needed the board as a body, but we always said you can make the decisions in the circles. And interestingly, when a board member was in one of these circles, people still asked, What would you say about this, Mario, or the colleagues from the board? You noticed they wanted a decision from us. Yes, exactly. And it was really hard to get that out of their heads. Yes, and I found that interesting. I found it really exciting.
Totally. And that's a bit of leading by example. Yes, I'm currently advising a company where the board complains that their team is not capable of making decisions, and the team complains that the board wants to make all the decisions. So a typical situation where you actually say, okay, what's going on here? And my observation there is that the system naturally converges. That means, of course, the board, the boss, or the manager naturally has the task of revising some decisions, or perhaps shaping parts of these decisions differently. That's the task. That's just how it is, and it will always happen. On the other hand, if as a team I am not able to make independent decisions and stick to them and justify them, but instead prefer to say, well, I'm uncomfortable with this, better let the boss or manager handle it, then of course this system converges to some extent, and you will never be able to promote this decision-making ability, and especially a certain autonomy within the teams.
Yes, dear Andre, we could chat forever, but I think our time is slowly coming to an end. I found it super, super exciting. Dear listeners, please give us likes, recommend us if you enjoyed it. As mentioned, we are also very, very grateful for feedback and input. And finally, we have a question or a request for you. Consider what you are willing to allow so that people in your organization can truly make an impact. And think about it with our input, because often it's the case that one is not willing to change things or let people be who they truly are.
That's right. And thus, we end up with the frustration, Mario, that we don't need.
Exactly. In that sense, have a great day, everyone.
Have a great day. Take care.